Hi, this is session 4, video lecture, actually part 4, and this is about the book of Ruth. Ruth is a little story that is a simple description of life during the period of the Judges. There are three main characters. There is Naomi, who is the matriarch, if you will, kind of a central type figure. She is a lady who is an Israelite person, and Ruth, who will become her daughter-in-law, and Boaz, who will become her son-in-law. The story goes along that Naomi and her husband and her sons moved to the land of Moab. Now, that is east of the Jordan River, so it's out of the promised land proper. It's in the area that was where the Israelites camped before they crossed the Jordan River into the promised land. So Naomi and her husband and her sons moved to Moab. Their two sons find a couple of local girls and get married. And so the sons marry, and for whatever reason, her husband dies and her two sons die. And so Naomi and her daughters-in-law are left alone. Naomi decides that she's going to go back home to her homeland, because there she would have relatives that would take care of her. Ultimately, Boaz is a distant relative, and so she confronts her two daughters-in-law. Ruth decides, and you may remember hearing this phrase, it's found in the book of Ruth, where Naomi says to Ruth and her other daughter-in-law, go back to your people. I'm too old to have any more sons, and so there's no chance of you remarrying. That would have been traditional in that culture. If a husband died, it would have been entirely appropriate in that culture for the husband's brother to marry his widow and therefore continue the family lineage. But Naomi was old, couldn't have any more sons, and she says, you need to go back to your people. I'm going to go back to my people, and one of my relatives will help take care of me. And so Ruth responds to her by saying, do not ask me to leave me, in the traditional King James that's sometimes quoted at weddings, entreat me not to leave you, or to refrain from go back from following after you, because Ruth says to Naomi, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. It is an act of devotion that a daughter-in-law has to her mother-in-law. And so Naomi's other daughter-in-law goes back to her people, but Ruth travels with Naomi back to her homeland, which is Bethlehem. Bethlehem certainly plays a role. That location, it's a little village 4 or 5 miles from Jerusalem, and of course is the birthplace of Jesus. And a part of this story connects with that. And so Naomi and Ruth go back to her homeland near Bethlehem. And the situation is this: unless someone intervenes, unless a relative intervenes to help take care of Ruth and Naomi, then chances are they will not survive. And so Ruth and Naomi, close this so you can see a little better. So Ruth and Naomi go back to Bethlehem, Naomi's hometown, and there in Bethlehem, there is the concept of a kinsman redeemer. Now, this is tied to property and that's passed on, that stays within the tribes and stays within the families. A kinsman redeemer, that concept understood that everything belonged to the Lord. And if a family member passed, rather than that land going to a stranger, the land would ultimately pass back to the family. You couldn't legally purchase land like the Smith family if Mr. Smith died, then the Jones family could not legally purchase the Smith land, increasing their family land, but it had to stay within the tribes, it had to stay within the family. You could essentially sell it temporarily, you could lease it, but ultimately it came back to the family. So a kinsman redeemer would do this. A kinsman redeemer would be a member of the family who had some resources, who would be able, when a relative died, they would have the resources to purchase that land back from a lease, from a temporary sale, and bring it back into the family, to restore the property to the legal family. So Naomi and Ruth go back to Bethlehem, and her husband's land, because her husband has died, Naomi's husband had died as well as her sons. There was no one to pass the land on to in the family. So she goes back, and it's in danger of being gone. Ruth and Naomi don't have anything. So they go back, and it's going to be the responsibility of a kinsman redeemer to redeem that land. So they go back to Bethlehem, and Naomi is aware that there is a kinsman redeemer person, and there is a second in line. And so the first kinsman redeemer, turns out he does not want to redeem the land, so he allows the second kinsman redeemer in line, this man named Boaz, to take responsibility of that. So what happens is, in the story, Ruth goes, and she's been going back into Boaz's fields gleaning. In other words, the harvesters have come and gathered most of the crops, but it was allowed that someone could go and get what was left that the harvesters did not pick up or did not harvest. And that was a way of taking care of the poor. So Ruth goes, and she's gleaning in Boaz's field. She tells the story to Naomi, her mother-in-law, and Naomi says, "Whoa, wait a minute, this is a relative." And she instructs Ruth to go that evening and lie down at the feet of Boaz. Now, that would have been a marriage proposal. And so Ruth goes and lies at his feet. And if he chose to marry Ruth, if Boaz chose to marry Ruth, then that would be the function of a kinsman redeemer, and the land would be restored. And so Boaz does that. It's called a leverate marriage, a levirate marriage, and it required the nearest relative to marry the widow. And so that closer relative was unwilling. Boaz was free to marry Ruth. And so Boaz and Ruth marry, and they are restored. Naomi and Ruth are restored to the family. The property is restored to the family. And the story goes on in that Ruth and Boaz have a son named Obed. Obed will have a son named Jesse, and Jesse will have a number of sons. One of them will be David, who will be the king of Israel, great king of Israel. What this does is it connects a foreigner. Ruth is a Moabitess. She is from Moab. So a foreigner is in the lineage of David. David's far, far, far descendant will be Jesus, the Messiah. And so what God does is he brings a foreigner into the lineage of the Messiah. The application of that, the implication of that, years and years later, is that Jesus is the Messiah, the Savior, who comes not just for Israel, but for the whole world. And so this marriage was almost like a miracle. There is a baby who would be born, ultimately would be Jesus, and all of this points to the sovereignty of God in dealing with history. It's ultimately God who watches over Naomi and Ruth, but it's also God watching over his people. He is continuing to be faithful to the covenant promise. One of the covenant promises to Abraham was, all the nations of the world will be blessed. You will be blessed, but through you, all of the nations of the world will be blessed. And so God is showing his faithfulness as it continues through this story. ultimately, God's covenant promises, the promises of being redeemed, the promise of coming into a relationship with God. Ruth comes into that picture. She comes into that lineage, and it supports that concept and idea that God's covenant is not limited just to the Hebrew people. It's not limited by nationality. It's not limited by race. It's not limited by gender. God's promises, his covenant faithfulness is to all people. And so it's a beautiful little video vignette almost of what life was like at the time of Israel. But even in everyday life, God is working to fulfill his covenant promises to one day provide for the redemption and salvation of the world. And so Ruth is a neat little story and a little part of that. So you enjoy that. After this video, I will be posting one more video tomorrow on Tuesday, and I will go over the study guide for the midterm exam. And so watch for that. I'll have it posted up hopefully by noon Tuesday. And if you guys have any questions about that, certainly let me know.